Tá hasar ma bheith seo agus gur mbeidh choiste as coile chorm. I'm very grateful for the invitation to participate in today's wonderful proceedings. I'm sorry I missed the first session, but certainly everything else has been wonderful. So we have three speakers today, and we'll start off with Dónall Ó Braonáin, who is taking the place of Barbara, who can't be with us. Dónall is Barbara's son-in-law and the son-in-law of the late Nua-Ghaeilge, who collaborated with Tim on many projects. And she's a Leitrim woman, and I've been thinking about another Leitrim woman today whose anniversary is coming up shortly, who was very much someone who understood the spirit and intention of Tim Robinson. That's Mary McPartland. So just to mention her name, to bring her spirit in with the rest. So without further ado, Dónall Ó Afisa Hort Dúin. Mahagona.
Good meeting Mahagui as Quidde Horts, Hector Laoire, Agus Piece Kainte, Iona, Moderator, Gore, Agus a Goibru, V. Either Tim, in the Groster, Liam, in the Groster Show, Mured, Trocritera, Agus Barbara, Agus Viavrin Teddy, Fedele Barb's Venture, Corinchi Banachti, Hogi, Agus Tashi, Harava Buach, Nessa, as a Kinaltus, Agus as a good Lord Ed Goibrusha. So the collaboration between Liam and Tim and Mured and Barbara goes back quite a number of years, and thanks to Nessa's kind invitation, it gave Barbara an opportunity to try and work out exactly when and how, the very basic questions of how they got together and from which, how did the work flow from there. So I suppose the initial story begins in Topeka in Kansas in 1989, where Liam was on a book tour promoting his book, Ireland of the Proverb. And he walked into a bookshop and found in the Irish section 2 books. One was Ulysses by James Joyce, and the other was Stones of Arran by Tim Robinson. So he had already heard of Tim Robinson from Breandán Ó Braonáin, from Breandán's frequent visits to Liam and Barbara in Blackrock in County Dublin. And they had heard quite a bit about it, about Tim Robinson and his work in Áran, and recounted this in an interview to Martin James of Foclóir, another Aaron man, on Siamsán Mainiach and Radio Gaeltachta. And Mured apparently was listening at home. And of course, Martin James was both delighted and surprised, but absolutely certain that this was the only possible thing that could happen in the middle of America, that in a bookshop you would find a book by James Joyce and, of course, a book on the Aran Islands. So that was in 1989. And we believe sometime in around 1990, 1991, Angela Burke, where Liam was working as director of the Irish Language Laboratory in UCD, brought Tim on a visit to the Teanglin, or to the Language Laboratory, and we believe that's where they first made a connection. Shortly after that, the essays which were published in the Connacht Tribune between 85 and 86, Mapping South Connemara, I think it was Angela's suggestion that these would make a fine translation, and Liam obliged. And I suppose there's 2 phases in this collaboration. From about 92, when Connemara Haas or Tugusanam appeared, and they were published by Cushcane, Pádraig Nuddy, and he did them proud. And then an expanded edition appeared, a bilingual edition, Irish and English, with more features, more place names from a wider area beyond Mainiach. That appeared in 2002. Cam Chort Connemara Haas, A Twisty Journey, I think is the English subtitle. So following 2002 to 2022, that marked a different period. But 1992, we saw Connemara Has, Acadamh. Liam was also very taken with the essay that was in the Gazetteer to the map of 1990 on Connemara. It is, of course, a seminal essay, and that appeared an Irish language translation, Spás am Connemara, appeared in 1993. Now, at this stage, Tim would have been closely reading everything that Liam translated, but they were very much Liam's translations. And then by the time Cámpúirt Connemara Has was published again by Coiscealbha in 2002, at that point, the year previously, Michael Cronin had, in an article in the Irish Times, made a very strong argument that Ghréanna Martin O'Kane's masterpiece should be translated into English. And Liam and Tim took this to heart, and they set about that task. And it would be difficult to imagine a more difficult text to translate, but that particular text couldn't have met a wiser collaboration, let's put it like that. So they began working on that in the years following 2002. That translation was ready and with the publisher by 2012. It eventually appeared. Yale University Press published it in 2016 as Graveyard Clay. That translation had the honour of winning the MLA Lois Roth Award for Literary Translation in 2017. And while that recognition in itself was most welcome, it was extremely important because they had another text that they had been working on, which was badly in need of a publisher. And they had searched high and low to try and publish this text. The text is Dónall Ó Braonáin, which is a compendium of Seanachas, or traditional lore, from Roisín, compiled and published in 1941 from about 13 different contributors by Sean McGillar. So this text was very important to both Liam and to Tim, and anyone who reads the Connemara trilogy can trace the influence of the text. It's absolutely peppered with references to that text. It is, I suppose, a rather unusual text, but it is extremely influential in the way that Tim approached the work he did, especially in Roisín. That area, that region of Connemara Has, or South Connemara, between Gaeilge and the Rush, just west of Inúr in Rosmuc. Okay, so you have a very defined space which was explored not only in a map, but also to a very sophisticated extent in a little Gaelic kingdom in the final part of the trilogy, and also in the translation which was finally published by Indiana University Press in late 2022, Connemara Chronicles, Tales from Roisín. The Lois Roth Award helped them to make a connection with an editor of particular vision, and Tim and Liam were both immensely grateful for that vision. And her name is Jenica Baines, and without her, Connemara Chronicles would not have seen the light of day. In terms of the chronology of the production of that, towards March, April 2019, both Liam and Tim, and indeed Murad, were in bad health. Their health was not what it once was. Murad and Tim were living in West Hampstead, and despite several attempts on the phone and on email to try and gather all the pieces together, there was still a missing piece of the jigsaw there, and that was Tim's preface. And myself and Liam's and Barbara's daughter, Maudine, we made the journey across in the last week of April to try and get the final piece of the jigsaw and to try and have a production plan for the manuscript. We had two extremely lovely sessions in Messina Avenue in the front parlour with Mairead and Tim, where everything was discussed. We had the pleasure of Tim reading out his preface, and we brought the preface home. This was of huge relief to Liam. I think we arrived home on Friday. We arrived home with the preface. We arrived home with a production plan. And on Saturday, Liam left us. So it was an extremely important part of Liam's work and Tim and Mairead's work that final conversation, if you like, took place, even if those are at a distance. Since then, I suppose, the work has gone on thanks to Indiana University Press. The book is now available. It is, I suppose, a testament to both Tim and Liam's approach to translation, that it is highly readable. And when you look at what they did with Nua-Ghaeilge and Graveyard Clay, you can also see and trace how exactly the collaboration deepened and developed. And I suppose collaboration is one of these words which is often thrown about, and I suppose we take it for granted. But I think true collaboration requires, to borrow some phrases from this morning, deep time and steep gradients. And I think Maya mentioned the Parnell, or the Parnell as we call it, or the Parnell as I think they call it over in Modlin, fellowship that Tim had in 2011. And when they were finalising Graveyard Clay, the final text, Barbara and Liam went across to Tim and Mairead over in Modlin. And they had, I think, a long weekend of discussion and debate, Shira Sinir, about the text. And I think it is the fruit of that collaboration. It is I suppose, they were, and Barbara is a child of the mid to late 30s. We were talking about four people who had very defined views of life, language, literature, but from, I suppose, that crucible came real trust and absolute faith in each other's judgment. And I suppose what Tim, I think, managed to convey in his note on the translation of Nua-Ghaeilge was that they sought to not just be faithful to O'Kane, but something more, I think, what's the phrase he has? Much more than word for word equivalence. And in dealing with such a canonical text, they understood that there would be people who would have very strong views about the result. But I think they found that that was, if you like, something that would spur them on. And they very much kept, again in Tim's phrase, to their own lights. And I think the text of Graveyard Clay, and I think the text of Dónall Ó Braonáin or Connemara Chronicles is all the better for that.
Next we have Choistealbha, who is a PhD researcher in Nua-Ghaeilge and the Centre for Irish Studies at the University of Galway. Her PhD research focuses on eco-critical readings of modern Irish language poetry. And she's also a poet herself, and I'm very glad to introduce her today.
Gur mille maith, agus gur mille maithigi freshness bhéileathair, gur mille maithigi Nessa agus Frank as an chorú con Kentja. Codja hien and tastruchan. It was December of last year, and I was in self-imposed exile in the Clifton Station House Hotel for 3 whole days to write the first chapter of my PhD thesis. Long overdue. I turned off my phone for the time I was there, and I'd write for, 7 or 8 hours during the day before wandering around Clifton town. It was in the Clifton bookshop that I picked up Tim Robinson's Setting Foot on the Shores of Connemara. I had read and enjoyed his other works previously, of course, but this was the first time I'd come across this book. Having no electronic devices to distract me, I bought the book and started reading it after I finished reading my chapter every night. It seemed quite a timely book to read. At the time, I was about to move to Carna, Connemara, to live with my partner of 7 years. I was leaving Galway City behind, heading to Mainiach, the stormy peninsula. On New Year's night this year, shortly before the last of my things moved back west with me, we went outdoors when the clock struck midnight. The sea surrounds everything, always humming, whispering, rushing, and we gazed out over it. I didn't think there was going to be any fireworks so far out west, and I was wrong, of course, as I am with so much about Connemara. There were fireworks exploding above Litchermores, Garumna, and Litchermallen. And it took me a second to figure out what these long-lasting single red fireworks were. Fishermen's emergency flares set up to celebrate the new year. And I didn't know what they were. So I stood watching one rise and descend over Litchermores, and I felt like I was standing on the shores of my home county, Donegal, watching Balor's single eye glare at me from Tory Island. Of course, I'd never seen an emergency fishing flare before. I say I'm from Donegal, but I always qualify that by saying that I'm from East Donegal, very close to the border, commonly called the Lagan area, where many young Gaeltachta people from Gweedore, Clough-Conneala, and so forth were sent to labour for the big farmers on the good land. I grew up with English, my parents grew up with English, my grandparents grew up with English, and so on and so forth. But I did learn Irish in school. I liked it, went to university, learned some more. I began to write poetry in Irish. I met my partner, whose first language is Irish. Now I'm living in Carna, one of the strongest remaining Gaeltachta. As I walk around the stormy peninsula of Mainiach, I become aware with every step of my privileged position. I chose to come here. I chose to speak Irish. I chose to write in Irish. Codjado, Stroncherry. I recently visited my partner's great aunt, Marda, who's 100 years old, the same age as the state, as Marawakati might say. Her room in the nursing home looks out over the sea, crashing blue against the speckles of islands past which she once rode. She doesn't recall much of her life anymore, but she does clearly still remember her youth on Illanincha, Finnish island, where she was born 25th of June, 1922. The island is now unoccupied, except for a few rebuilt houses that some island descendants occasionally use, usually during summertime. Unoccupied after thousands of years of inhabitation from at least the Mesolithic period, about 7,000 years ago. The island is accessible by boat or by walking at low tide. I stood on this uncovered pathway recently at low tide, hearing the curlews call back and forth, not moving, not walking, not speaking, in an in-between place. Marda could still speak of gathering carrageen and dillisk, drying them out for sale, making footballs out of cow hair, to kick about with her siblings, walking to the shop on the mainland at low tide and buying 4 things: tay, bran, plur, agus shukra, and the timony that would ensue during summer nights when people from Inish Trowers and other neighbouring islands around Finnish, also still occupied at the time, would gather together in Finnish. Unoccupied places, empty houses, the clachan of Shanachonal nestled in the hills, roofless, past which I drove today. Chach Vebing Fajin Wab across the road from me, a house on Weenish, bricked, closed. I had written poems in the past once expressing my frustration at my being one of the Stranchéirí. I thought learning Irish on its own would be enough, but it wasn't, it isn't, it should not be enough to know a place fully if language is hermetically sealed away from the life of the community. It's not going to do it. And yet, at the time, I was frustrated by this, petulant, angry about it. I didn't know my place, or even if I should have a place here. Cudgetry, Raidió. I was frustrated, that is, until I realised that I could look to another writer who was keenly aware as well of his own position in Connemara, who had also learned Irish and had also undertaken an act of colonial reparation by writing about the place with tenderness and care that made me reflect on my own irritable and petulant early verse. I could forget about myself and write something of this place into poetry in a way that was not reactive or egotistical, but patient and listening, with a lightness of touch, a tenderness, an understanding that I didn't always have to speak first. So Tim Robinson's practice became a little bit of a touchstone for me, a reference point, a guiding hand on my shoulder as I walk and write my way around Mainiach Island, Tra, Roisín the Mainiach, Gaeltachta, feeling the texture of the lichen clustered on the tops of the fence posts, seeing old fireplaces long cold through the windows of ruined houses, hearing the slow drip of sea rain on granite walls. If I could reflect something, the wisp of a single cloud or a beam of light of the sun setting behind Ullainn in February in a poem, I should do it. I felt I had to do it. I could maybe be a conduit of unveiling, of showing my new locale. In this, I humbly follow on from other Connemara poets, writers, storytellers and singers, Mícheál Ó Cuaig, Sean O'Charain, Sorcha Ní Huairim, Éamon the Burke, Martin O'Kane, Mícheál Ó Conghaile, Breed Ní Mhuilcheorainn, Pádraig Ó Conradh, Kathleen Maud, Mary O'Malley, Jackie McConaughey, Tim Robinson, Liam McInerney, and many, 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 many others. I'm going to end here with a poem that I composed this year. I was looking out from Tra Roisín the Mainiach towards Ullainn as the sun set behind the island, throwing the jagged gables of the ruined homes into sharp relief like miniature pyramids. Wispy, dark clouds were caught in the sun's lake of gold, making it look for a moment like the island was still occupied. Smoke from turf fires still blazing inside the hearths, cow hair footballs bouncing against the gable ends of the houses. This poem, unbidden, rushed over me like the incoming tide on this shore of Connemara on which I had set foot. Sculpture of or awan, Charghriddle and Ullainn, is Latnian buachan and Tullish na fotri. Tanjelta buga following I lacht orga na Gréine, Cosala na Ribani Jati, ag Airi o na Shimléir, Tra. Gur mille maithigí.
Finally, we have Breandán, distinguished Professor of History at University of Galway. Among his many publications is The End of Outrage, winner of the Michael Dion Prize in 2018.
Okay. Good evening, Mainiach. I have no close connection to Tim Robinson, although at one stage, about 2007, I published an essay by him in a magazine I edited with Seamus Dean, and he was a pleasure to deal with. When I was asked to participate in today's event, I was told that it was about remapping landscapes. I was told it was about architecture on the edge. I was told this by Jane Conroy, and I mulled over it, and yes, I could do something on the natural, built and cultural environments of North Donegal. I could talk a little too about mapping and remapping, naming and renaming. And because it was Jane, I could talk about France. But to do this will require me to engage in an act of self-flagellation for some things which I should have known, which I did not know long ago. And when it comes to self-flagellation, public self-flagellation, I have four. Lillis here mentioned a book that I did. This is a book that was done about 6 or 7 years ago on the social, cultural, political changes that came over North Donegal in the time of the famine. My portal into that world is this building here. It's Bay National School. It's 12 feet by 22 feet, thatched roof, mud floor. National School opened in 1845 with 100 children on the rolls. Very humble building, but if you look at Griffith's valuation, you'll find that it was valued at 15 shillings when a typical house was valued at 5. Okay, so we can just imagine conditions then. But that was my portal into the mid-19th century because the schoolmaster there, Patrick McGlynn, informed on a secret society that wanted to enact revenge upon a land grabber who was proposing to, having taken land off people, was proposing to evict his subtenants. And this resulted in a large court case. I had lots of archival documents, wrote my book. The book was well received. In the course of the book, I followed Patrick McGlynn to Australia. He lost a child en route to Australia, found out that he changed his religion, that he continued to be a school teacher, but I lost track of him after he got fired from that job, after he got heavily in debt. But the book was well received, and Patrick McGlynn wasn't central to my story. I was getting nice reviews, everything was going well, the ego was growing. And then I received an email from Australia by a fellow who'd read the book, and he said I was very interested in that Patrick McGlynn character, and I poked around Ancestry.com, and in a very dark corner of it, I found a letter that he wrote to some family members in America. Great, says I. And the letter gave his father's name. He wrote the letter to his father who'd moved to Scotland, and some people then emigrated to the US and took the letter to Pittsburgh. But myself and the guy who emailed me, who was working for the Internal Revenue in Australia, got talking. And he said that he was an amateur genealogist. He proved a very good genealogist, which I imagine people working for the Internal Revenue could be. And we did a little bit more work on it. But this guy, this amateur, I'm supposedly the professional, he quickly established that Patrick McGlynn had changed his name to Hubert Patrick Macklin. And once we established that he changed his name, all sorts of things came forward. We found that he'd written a letter home to the Derry Journal in the 1870s, not identifying himself as this big informer, but talking about how he had, what conditions were like in Australia, and teasing people that he'd left Donegal in 1857. We were able to push on, and we were able to find a photograph of him. I had imagined Patrick McGlynn, because of the upbringing I received in a good Republican household, I had imagined the informer to be kind of a weasel, a rat, or whatever. But it turned out he was a big, tall man who wore a big, tall hat. Okay, so I was way off the mark on that. And having found that, we were able to find the grave he erected over his wife. And it's a remarkable grave in that the gravestone has an inscription in Irish: Laoighseach Ulta Abu. Up the strong arm of Ulster. Let the men die and women live resisting oppression, whatever that means. And then, Laoire Mara Nagatan. And this has puzzled me. I think it could be Laoire Mara Nagatan. So the day over, tomorrow, the rays, the sunrise, or something like that. But I've never been able to figure out what it means. But while Patrick McGlynn had ceased to be important to the story I wanted to tell about social and cultural change in West Donegal, I was kicking myself for a long time. So to borrow Nicola's phrase, I was darkening the ego very quick about 8 months after my book came out. Which brings me to the matter of France. This is North Donegal. The big peninsula in the middle is Inishowen. West of it is the peninsula of Fanad, and between them is Laoighseach. As Laoiseach has just described, the Lagan district, which is just south of it, is extremely good land. And it's very flat, rolling country that goes straight into Derry. So from the bottom of Laoiswilly into Derry is approximately 10 miles. Okay, but you can see there the quality of the land. It's better land than County Meath. And what's important about Laoiswilly is that it allows you to get very close to a major city in the north of Ireland. And in the late 18th century, that was important. When the Republican United Irishmen were trying to interest the French Directory in invading Ireland, they communicated to them that Laoire was very difficult to get into, and that it was awkward to come up to the port of Derry that way, but that if they came in Laoiswilly and came up Laoiswilly, that they'd be very easily able then to go across fertile country with lots of horses, lots of cattle, and to take the city of Derry. While it was garrisoned, one of the regiments, the Tipperary Regiment, had been suborned. Now, this particular communication fell into the hands of the British. So the British were aware in 1797 that the French were looking at Laoiswilly, or had been alerted to the fact that Laoiswilly was an area that they could attack. And the French would ultimately make a descent on Laoiswilly. And you'll often read in history books the Battle of Laoiswilly. There's one history book that refers to a battle in Laoiswilly. Now, the battle wasn't in Laoiswilly, it was much further west. And this is when, in 1798, Wolfe Tone came with the French fleet to Ireland. This would be referred to in Irish as Laoibhreis de War an Airige, the day of the great big sea battle. Not much else happened, okay? But the British had been alerted to this, and they had identified at a very late stage a number of points where they could construct batteries on Laoiswilly to defend Laoiswilly. And they're there today. The batteries hadn't been completed at the time that Wolfe Tone made his descent on Laoiswilly. But gun emplacements had been put in place, but they were not called into action. But they're very impressive fortifications. This is Dunree, which is, really does command the full entrance to the bay, or a significant narrowing of Laoiswilly. Another view of it. And all these remains of the French Revolutionary or Napoleonic Wars are here in Laoiswilly, Martello Towers and so forth. A very impressive battery at Rathmullen. And they're very big constructions. Okay. And these would finally have been completed in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. But there's another type of building that was built. And it's these things here, which are signal stations. They consist of a station and a guardhouse. The guardhouse is the big, tall building. You'll notice the mast at the lower building, the station, and flags would be put up on that. And a series of these were built all around the western and southern coast of Ireland that would allow communication to Dublin of any sightings of French ships. So they're very impressive buildings, and they've been well studied, I should say, by colleagues in the Atlantic Technological University in Sligo, who did a wonderful project on them. And these are some early 19th century drawings of them. And many of these are still extant. But with flags, a system of flags and signal balls, they'd be able to communicate to Dublin the number of French ships that had been seen. So there's some of the signals that they would have used. Did you see a frigate? Did you see 6 frigates? And this Chinese whisper would get all the way to Dublin, or 600 frigates coming, or whatever. Okay? So we have these physics, and this is just some architecture by the people in Sligo, who've a really wonderful project that didn't get much fanfare. But I learned a lot from it, not least, and you can access it online, not least that these towers were originally clad with slate. They were only in use for a very short period, 5 or 10 years, and the natives quickly acquired the slate, I imagine, afterwards. But that's a renovated one at the head of Kinsale, and you get a sense of just the modernity of these buildings. Okay, so there we have in Donegal, we have a big sea battle. We have these great fortifications on Laoiswilly, all reminding us of that period in history and the threat to the British from France. And we've got these signal towers as well. And there's an awful lot of folklore. Lillis O'Leary would have many songs that come from the period and refer to France and the prospect of the French arriving. And there's lots of anecdotes in Ranafast people can point out to you. A little hill people went up to watch the Laoighseach War Remapping, the great sea battle. In Gaeltachta, the Johnsons of Gaeltachta hid their gold the day that the battle was going on off the coast. In Inishowen, there was a landlord's wife was sitting down to dinner as the battle was raging on. She had her starter, she had her main course, on she went. And the butler eventually said to her, "Cheese, ma'am?" And she replied, "Cheese? With the French bombarding us, will he?" You know, so there's lots of that stuff, and you think you know it all. Some years ago, I worked on a book with a colleague of mine, David Dixon in Trinity College. It's a memoir of life in 19th century Donegal. And this is what it looks like. It was written by a man named Hugh Dorian, who was born in poverty in Fanad. And he wrote this in 1890, describing the changes that came over his community in the 19th century. By that stage, he was living in the Bogside in Derry, or in Alexandra Place, another reference to that period. And he wrote this just to describe what transformation had come over it. When we worked on that, we worked from photostats made in the mid-20th century. The original was believed to have been lost. Although clearly intended for publication, it had never been published. And it subsequently reappeared. But 7 or 8 years ago, I got an email from a dentist in Derry saying he had something I might like to look at. And it turned out that he had this book. Wow. His father had been working as a manager in the school when St. Colum's College in Derry moved to another location. There was an old bookcase there, and the priest, who's president of the school, said, "You can take that thing with you or throw it out, that bookcase." And that was in the bookcase. And it's significant in that it is the longest lower class account of the famine, and it's important for that reason. But if you look a bit closer at it, I tend to emphasize that there's a wonderful chapter at the beginning, descriptive scenery, and it's followed then, which is very Robinson-esque, but it's followed by a series of chapters that center on the method and source of literary instruction. So he talks about the school and schoolmaster. And he talks about how this schoolmaster, who was a soldier who had come back, who had fought in the Peninsular War and come back to his native Fanad and set up a school. He talks about the impression he made in the community in the 1830s and 1840s. How he'd go to meetings at night where they'd discuss certain things, and the wars of the late 18th, early 19th century were much discussed at them. The master's revenge, how the master, this French veteran of the French wars, took his spleen out on somebody by writing poems about them and so forth. But he also talks about church education society schools, proselytizing schools that were trying to convert Catholics, and the Cathbrac or Irish teaching, which was a variant upon that. Okay, so he's very interested in education, and Dorian himself taught as a school teacher for a while before moving to Derry. In his account of the famine, it's very much a nationalist account of the famine. He says it was like next to slow murder. He doesn't say it was slow murder. He said it was next to slow murder. And he said this was where the government dealt out the successful blow, the great blow for getting rid of the people. Okay, so it's a nationalist analysis. But at the end of it, he says, at least when it was over, it got rid of some turbulent and indifferent characters who were only a disgrace to the good, the honest, and the well-doing. In other words, he said it got rid of some bad bastards I didn't like. Okay, so it really brings home like the horror of famine and what famine is like. But here's his description of signal towers, those towers. He describes how he refers to them as Martello Tower, a mistake people often make. And he refers to how they're standing memorials to the memory of Old Boney. He says, no wonder the English took good care of the wonderful hero after he surrendered to them. For by that act he relieved them of many a restless day and sleepless night. Such was their dread while Boney conquered, that an extraordinary large seagull's wing appeared on the horizon. It was, in the hurry of the moment, taken for French canvas and this telescope adjusted, okay? So he's got this idea that this is how things operated a generation before he was born with the signal towers. Sorry, don't have handouts for you, but here he's describing the old soldier. He describes the old soldier who'd seen the Sierras, the placid rivers, and the sunny land of Spain during the sojourn of Wellington on the continent. Like many of his class, he had seen many and strange things, and could a round varnished tale deliver of the wondrous fortunes and sieges he has passed. So you've got this fella coming back with an army pension and drinking his pension, okay? And he claimed to be in every engagement in the Peninsular War, but he didn't say that he was at Waterloo. He said he was within a day's march of Waterloo. But he sets himself up as a schoolmaster, and it's a massive figure. He is a massive figure in Dorian's narrative. Okay? Here, Dorian's describing what he was like when the children were given exercises in the hedge school. The hedge school is not in a hedge, it's an unofficial school. And he said that he'd been in this sort of meditative mode. He'd be there muttering to himself, rhyming out the names of great battles that he'd participated in, or the names of regiments, and so on. And, you know, France is a major presence, and this would-be Waterloo hero is a major presence in the narrative. This is what people talked at meetings late at night. You know, when people would gather, when the schoolmaster would wander around and stay in different children's houses, they talk of Nelson, Wellington, Bonaparte, the Nile, Waterloo, Copenhagen, okay? And, you know, local families would get nicknamed, or local people, because of their characteristics, would be called Wellington or Nelson or Bonaparte. The latter name in particular struck as a cognomination to the man and his generation for the reason that it happened to be more applicable, he being of a quarrelsome and fighting disposition, okay? So you're getting the sense of, in the 1830s, in the 1840s, when this guy was young, that the shadow of what had happened in the late 18th, early 19th century was very, very long. To be moved? Okay. There's a lovely little passage which may well be autobiographical, where he describes with the kind of proselytizing schools that a little boy went to one of these proselytizing schools set up by the minister, and the minister used to give as prizes a copy of the Bible, the King James Bible. And the little boy was so delighted, and he came home and he showed it to his father with his name written on it by the minister. And the father's countenance did not seem to rejoice in the act. He did not even take hold of the book. He gave no word of encouragement, nor did he seem pleased. But on the contrary, he was in sour temper, and after a little said, when he gave his opinion, did not wish to be too severe, but he said that he did not care for such a book. And to cool the young lad in his disappointment, he gave his excuse that his notion was more for the historical than that of the theological learning, and dispatched the lad back next day with orders to return the Bible and to ask for the history of France, okay? And when the wee fellow goes back and asks for the history of France, the family becomes targeted by the minister, okay? And years later, according to Dorian, and it seems to be autobiographical, he enacts his revenge upon the family. Okay. The same year that I got that letter from Australia, the year after that other book came out, I was up in Fanad giving a talk about Dorian and the famine. And I gave my talk, and a fella says to me, did you ever look at the Ordnance Survey map? And I says, did I, yeah? After the talk. You know, we were just chatting. And he says, you should look at Kinney Lake. It was marked as Kinney Lake on the first Ordnance Survey map. And sure enough, there's Kinnelough, or Kinnelough, on the first Ordnance Survey map. And there in the bottom of it, this map made in the 1830s is Gibraltar Rock. And there's more to come. This is exactly the place where this schoolmaster was teaching. Over here we have St. Helena and Elba. And Nicola can talk very well of the importance of darkening the ego. My ego has been darkened many times. Thank you very much.
So we have time for some questions, I think, if people would like to ask them.
I don't think Tim Robinson would have missed Elba, Helena and Gibraltar.
Question, Joe? Yeah.
I loved our arrival in Mainiach and that whole experience, and contrasting with Tim, because Tim was an outsider and didn't ever consider himself an insider. That wasn't his function, and he never seemed to. He was consciously an outsider, and knowing he was never going to be an outsider, but that gave him that insight to be able to work and get on and all the rest of it. So it's a very particular place that you're in, and you described it so really beautifully there.
Thanks very much.
But Tim's work has gaps all over the place in it. You know, there's things he says and there's other things he doesn't say about his whole journey. And the maps were central to his journey. The notion that he says that the maps weren't important. They were the crachalach, they were the skeleton of his whole later career. I have his first map somewhere in the house on Aaron. There was hardly 10 places on the map. And as he improves that first one that he did as a tourist map, the island sucks him in and it never lets him go. But it's that very first approach that he makes as a map maker. That's all of this and all his literature comes out of that. Because he gets deeper, and that's what excites him. But he was also conscious of, he was able to record it because he was the outsider, because he wasn't considered Foclóir, he was considered Remapping. That was his name locally. People look forward to coming, and he had that lovely, gracious way about him. But he was a hard man as well. He was very English in his dedication, his Germanic way of doing things. I was in the field lots with him over many years, and very focused researcher, and but a very easy way with people, with ordinary people, and very, you know, just. And so your journey there reminded me so much of him in lots of ways. So it was a lovely tribute, lovely tribute to him and to yourself. So Carmine Maga.
Anyone else? Thank you, Mike. Jane.
So I wanted to say thanks to Breandán for the French connection. Very important. Nicola had it there and embodied it for us, and thanks for that. But I also think it's just one quick comment was that the Robinsons really liked Paris. They really, really did. And I know that Nicola and Derval took them round quite a lot when they were there, and we had a book launch of Conmar and elsewhere in the Irish Embassy in Paris and so on. But they enjoyed Paris. So I just always like to think that it's a world that they had without boundaries. They didn't, you know, they were not bounded by where they were, and that effort of imagination that takes us back into the past or takes us into different moments of Irish history and so on. That imagination also worked, as we know, in other places as well. And I just think it's wonderful that you brought France into it. Well done.
We'll draw things to a close now and proceed. I think Dr. Cronin is going to address us, one of the organisers and a great colleague over the years in the Centre for Irish Studies, an interdisciplinary scholar. She's published a lot in this area, and she's going to draw all the threads together in the final talk today.
I just want to say, actually, we have an additional book out in the foyer area where you kind of registered and you got your little wristbands out, or down below the stairs. It's the Laoire Cóhrón a bhí going ag an ócáid a bhí going ar an saoin Chicata, where we had the scattering of the ashes in Roundstone. So we made a book of condolences for Tim and Mairead. So we brought it here with us today because many of you were unable to be there in November. And if you would like to sign it it, we'd be delighted for you to have that. And we're going to bring it back to the university in the archives and open it up to members of the public in Galway as well for people to come and to pay their respects. So just to make a note about that as well. Also just want to say for Barbara, the Bronarum in Jovnak Revshi now in our haunta agus the Sulagum Gamek Bishakir Higalua Anish. So just a note of acknowledgement for Barbara as well. Today, I suppose we've had this richness of a day and an opportunity in many ways to pay homage and to give honour for the friendship, I think, primarily, that has been there over the years since 1972, and hopefully for the friendships that are going to progress after today as well in the years to come. When we were talking about this originally as an event that we may do on the occasion of the exhibition being here at the kind invitation of Liz McConnell and all of the Benedictine community here in Colmore, the first kind of discussion we had really was that we wanted it as an opportunity for people to get back together again. We've had very difficult years with COVID. Many of us have lost loved ones, not just Tim and Mairead, but other people in this room have lost loved ones as well. And we also wanted to have the opportunity to invite members of the community, both in Connemara and wider afield as well, to come back for a day to Connemara and to embrace all of the richness of what we have for that reason. So for that reason, we decided it wasn't going to be a hybrid online event. We wanted it primarily to be physically back here in person, but we have received permission from the speakers to record parts of the session. So some of this will go online afterwards as a record of the day, but also to invite people to come and view it afterwards as well. So I want to thank you all very much for making the effort to be here in the wind and the rain, whether you came across a shore or by car, but we just want to say thank you all for all of you for being here with us today. I'm just going to make just a very few brief comments. I got the great job of summing up the afternoon and the morning, but just to say a few things that struck out, and I'm sure that have struck many of us from listening to all of the speakers this morning and this afternoon. But one of the most important things I think that I will come away with is this need to come back to and to retain and protect this idea of a basic act of attention. And whether it's our phones, whether it's life, whether it's COVID, whether it's work or distractions, it's something that I think has been a real touchstone for many of us listening to the work about Tim and what Tim's work has meant to other people, is it has made us stop in our tracks and maybe have a look around the world and pause and think about our place on the earth and where we are stepping on the shores of Connemara and how we might do that lightly for the generations to come as well too. We also had discussions of an insider and an outsider, and I will always preface this by saying I'm the Cork woman here in the audience. I'm here with the Donegal crowd as well. Bronar and Dónall Ó. We put you in with the bad crowd. But this is a discussion that comes up not just in Ireland, but in other countries as well, where there may be sensitivities about areas and regions where they may have been overstudied or overpopulated, depopulated, have had histories that are very difficult, trauma and challenges to be negotiated and reparations to be made in different ways. And with all of that, I'm always reminded of the writings of Kevin Whelan, where he talks about the importance of filiation and affiliation. The filiation is what we have through our blood relations, our DNA, Ancestry.com, whether it's inland revenue in Melbourne or Australia or elsewhere, but also the politics of affiliation, the place that we choose to make our home, and the places that make us feel welcome as a stranger within that home as well. And I'm always reminded of the work of Nua-Ghaeilge in that as well, in terms of her being born outside of Ireland, coming back to Ireland as a child, making the Irish language her home. And she always would say, I would have the Gaeltachta in my kitchen up in Dublin. I didn't have to go back to West Kerry for it. I had it every time I put on Raidió na Gaeltachta. And I think that's a really important lesson that we have from the work and the writings of Tim and Mairead, and the experiences that we all had, those of us that were privileged to be there in their home, it was very much a welcome to the stranger, but also to remind ourselves we issue from everywhere, as Sean O'Riordan says in one of his poems. There is not one place on the earth that we're not from, and that we are all kin in one way or the other. And that's a very important reminder for us in these very sensitive political times, I think, as well too. A final kind of note on language, which I think in some ways was probably the first portal that Tim fell into. It was probably language that he fell in love with, and then through that it was the landscape back into the language again. And I'm always sensitive and aware of particularly what Finola was talking about as well, the sharp gradients that are there, the sensitivities through which we have to navigate our ways in these spaces and places. And the difference in Ireland when we talk about land, the land, and landscape. And landscape might seem like a foreign term for many people in Ireland, like environment might seem like a foreign term in some sense. And then we think in Irish we have tír, tíreach, talún, talamh. And these all mean very different meanings and senses as well. And we have all of those different kinds of perspectives in Tim's work. And I think just the final thing I just want to say is about this idea of dimensionality. He often talked about the challenges of bringing a 3D landscape onto the 2 dimensions of the page, but then he was the 4th dimension as the cartographer, and how that disappears as the work is evolving and emerging, which I think is really, really interesting. I'm just going to finish up just with a couple of items from the archive itself and from Tim. And from the Burren, and it's actually really lovely today. Anytime we've done events or organised symposia or workshops or community mapping workshops, mostly in Galway, most of the discussion has been centred around Connemara and the Aran Islands, and it's so lovely that actually we've had so much discussion around the Burren today. So I'm going to acknowledge that and continue with that here. So we found this extraordinary letter, which he noted as Burrenology, from a gentleman called Liam McGlynn. And it was a letter to Tim Robinson that runs to the not unworthy amount of 300 pages. So in beautiful handwriting and very clearly instructing Tim the things that he missed. And on the manuscript on page 24, Liam McGlynn writes, "I have been turning the names that I do not understand the meaning of over in my mind, trying to remember how the old people said them or any jokes that they may have made about the names. I'm almost sure that Sesha means hazel forest around Sesha Moor, and there was even more when I was young before reclamation grants. However," he's telling Tim, "ask the scholars. Somebody must have written down Sesha in the last 1,000 years. So, I mean, that's deep time for you, but also acknowledging Tim should have access to these scholars for over the last 1,000 years. The best part, he waits a little bit later, you turn the page, and he says, reminding Tim, "The Bell Harbour people are the most pishoguk, superstitious people in Ireland, but that's another matter." And so it continues for 300 pages. In the final edition of when he was updating the Burren map, there's a section at the end where he talks about the updating map, and this will come back to what we were talking about this morning. And he always saw the maps as what he called the interim reports of my own progress, that they were never the final word. It was always a temporary snapshot of a place and time. So in this from 1999, he writes, "In updating my map, I've had to delete a holy well, a children's burial ground, a boulder that was a saint's chair, and several other precious details lost to agri-vandalism. However, the institution of the Rural Environment Protection Scheme and the spread of the Burren National Park foretell, I hope, the end of the age of the bulldozer. To create an economy worthy of its setting in the Burren will call for the inventive powers of the nation and the local community. My contribution is this map of our holdings and responsibilities." And I think I'd like just to finish my comments there on that, because it is about this idea of the holdings, and he had this idea that a map should invite you into the place, but it should hold you there for a while with that active attention. And indeed, there is that responsibility, and we were talking about it this morning, the responsibility of trust and judgment, the responsibility of the archive of the past into the future, and to value what we have in so many different ways. That is the legacy of Tim Robinson's work. So, Gur Míle Maith Agad.